I
Yeah, he
cried.
only lived up here for a few years when he was young, but
He went to Whitman Elementary. Yeah, I watched them dismantle when Northern bought it. I watched them dismantle it and I was not happy because I have a lot of good memories
yeah.
there, my childhood memories. Okay, so uh I think left off around here. Oh, before I get into this, so tomorrow you start your unknowns, your unknown bacteria experiment. Plus, you can finish, keep working on your case study stuff. Are we getting close to being done with our case study stuff? All right, so talk to your lab instructor about that if there's still some outstanding tests that you need to do, but um, regardless, we will start the unknowns, but it's a group project, so if you have to do both, that tomorrow and it'll work. So I'm gonna meet with Duncan and Isabella later today to firm everything up for that. So that's your last project for the lab. And then you have, you already did the lab exam, right? So you're done with the lab exam. No more of those. And then this project, the unknown, is your last project. Okay, I think we left off here where we were looking at human microbe interactions and the more they look, the more they find on how influential the microbes in your gastrointestinal tract can be, not only on what's happening in that part of your body, but throughout your whole body. And so we were looking at the idea of probiotics because that has become kind of a logical thought to this idea, could we use probiotics to help people live a healthier lifestyle, better outcomes, prevent certain diseases? And so they're really looking at that, but it's far from where they have any kind of ideal probiotic out there. They're starting to realize you're going to need to go the way of personalized medicine, where the patient has to, they have to understand your microbiome and then figure out ways to support your health through manipulating your microbiome. So there's still a lot of work to do. This is not regulated by the FDA, the probiotics you buy. And so you really have to be your own researcher on if you ever choose to use a probiotic, you have to do some research because it's not regulated. So you have to be very careful. So I said that, whoops, where is it on this list? Oh yeah, the very last bullet. Most of the commonly used probiotics are gram-positive bacteria because they don't have that cell wall structure that has the lipopolysaccharide like the gram-negatives do. And that has been kind of the theme for probiotics, except now they're finding this one, Akkermansia muciniphila, and it's gram-negative. And they're finding that it can do amazing things for people. And under their studies that they've investigated this. And so in this particular paper, this is a title from published study where they were looking at inflammatory bowel disease, obesity, diabetes. So they were kind of looking at what role does this microbe play. This is the species, by the way, that in the older literature, at least some of the scientists made it seem like this one was not so good for us, but it was a misunderstanding. Once they got more data, they realized, oh, no, this one. So just be careful about that. Try to find the more current research on a lot of these studies so that you can feel like you've got the most current information. But from this paper, they were looking at what's the impact. They did human studies too, but they started out with mice studies. And they were looking at giving this particular bacteria as a probiotic idea. And they were seeing good impacts on reducing obesity and type 2 diabetes in humans. And in the mouse study too, they were looking at type 1 diabetes and looking at that. And you could see some common themes here where you have reduction of inflammation with the presence of Akkermansia. You see the mucus is better. You have a better mucus barrier. the immune function is better. And so for this particular microbe has been kind of zoomed in on. A lot of scientists are very interested in this and trying to figure out how this particular one seems to be so good for so many of us. And so keep your eye on that. You may end up seeing some probiotic supplements where this is touted as, you know, a high population number in this probiotic, and it's gonna be helpful. So the research is ongoing, but that's, as far as I know, that's the only gram-negative that they're thinking of turning into a probiotic in the near future. Most of them are definitely gram-positive species, so. So all of these studies are showing, the more recent studies are just, you know, well, even in the name, but, you know, mucinophila. Mucin is referring to the mucus that you produce in your gastrointestinal tract. That's the barrier. And remember, the mucus layer is, you know, two layers essentially. You have a looser layer and then a more firm, denser layer. But phila, if you're a audiophile, that means you love music. So phila means to love. And so right in the name, you can tell that they discovered that Akkermansia likes to hang out in the mucus of your gastrointestinal tract. And that's what, at first they were worried about that. Then they realized, oh no, it's doing all kinds of cool, good things. It's not harming or trying to attack and get into your blood vessels or whatever. So they know that microbes in general, not just Akkermansia, but microbes in general, as, you know, especially if you imagine, you know, baby being born or developing in the uterus, actually, not even to the point of birth, but as you're developing in the amniotic sac, you are definitely, you know, developing your whole body systems. And they're finding with germ-free mice that if you look at the progression and development of the mice babies, that they have altered morphology of their gut. So their gastrointestinal tract is physically different than if you have normally raised mice, and different in a bad way, where usually the gut is shorter, it doesn't have as much villi, it just lacks the architecture and morphology. And they know that it can also stimulate blood vessel formation, which is important because, of course, we're such a complex multicellular organism. We need really good blood vessel system to transport all of our chemicals around our body. And the immune system, they're finding out more and more about this, that the microbes in your gut are heavily influencing your immune system. A lot of your immune system cells are in the gut area, and that the presence of those microbes, the chemicals they're excreting, their ability to alter gene expression in your cells is influencing, including the immune system cells. And so that's really exciting research looking at that, that they can actually influence your gene expression. When they were looking at some of these studies, especially with the immune system function of your, in the gut area in particular. So this idea of, you know, if we could better understand this, could we do personalized medicine where different patients will receive different cocktails of, you know, mixtures of probiotic microbes? They're already finding some studies where they're saying, you know, these could be really good potential probiotic cocktails. So bacillus, bifidobacteria, these are bifidobacteria species, and Prevotella. And you can see the main therapeutic effect. You know, they're looking at anti-cancer, diet, you know, prevention of diabetes. You don't really have to know mechanism of action, but just thinking about these ideas of what are they looking at right now for potential probiotics. You can see that there's a range of different disease states that they're targeting and looking for, you know, just general inflammation, of course. If you can knock out inflammation in your body, that chronic inflammation, that goes a long way to overall health. And there again, there's Akkermansia, and they're looking at obesity, diabetes, those types of things. So they are really finding that, you know, it's been known for a long time that having, you know, the coexisting microbes with you helps protect you against pathogens. Like if you get exposed to pathogens, if you're well colonized already, then the pathogen has a harder time gaining a foothold in your body because it's taken up by all the good microbes. And they've known that for a long time, but with heavier research, they're finding out all these other added benefits. And really, you can't function to maximum health without your microbes. You just can't. They've done on some unfortunate studies where, babies that had got really, really, really sick and they had to really give the baby full spectrum antibiotics where it just wiped them out, all the good bacteria, and then the progression of that baby into toddlerhood and young adulthood was really just, the baby was very sick the whole time and, on the verge of dying several times. And this is only one case study that I'm talking about, but it was a very powerful case study showing that if you wipe out the microbes at such a crucial age of development, it can be disastrous. So this one is just getting at the idea of, you need your microbes right from the start. You have to have your microbes. And so, of course, they can do this with mice studies. They don't do it with human studies. That wouldn't be ethical. But they can show in many mouse studies that they've done to this point that your immune system doesn't get worked out and gets matured. That won't happen unless there's microbes there to kind of challenge your immune system and interact with your immune system to kind of work it out and make it stronger. And so that's what it's getting at here. And then, they've done these studies where they take germ-free mice that are suffering with their immune system under development, then they plug them with probiotics, and you can see that it goes back. Their immune system bounces back, which is a great thing, that they're not destined and doomed to a failed immune system. They're saying, there's the ability of the organism to bounce back if you give the right preventative or the intervention treatments at the right time. So that's very encouraging. So of course, a lot of, so some of the early research on the microbiome, they were looking at, does the microbiome have any impact on the weight of the host? Whether it's obese or lean or what, does it have any impact? And so some of the earlier studies, looking at these cute little mice, but this was one of the first studies that was really looking at this from the microbiome perspective. And these pie charts are looking at really, they're honing in on the Firmicutes and the Bacteroidetes phyla. And I mean, if you just look at those pie charts, you can see a difference in who's there and at what population levels, relative population levels. And so you can see with the obese mouse, so what they did was they, I think this was a fecal transplant study where no, that's coming later. So here they're showing with the Firmicutes showing up at higher population levels in the obese mouse compared to with the lean mouse, they had more Bacteroidetes. So this was one of the first studies that came out. This was only at the phyla level. This is not very, that's a huge classification. So many organisms belong into that. So this is a very coarse analysis that they did. But you can see that there's a clear difference. So when this information was published, it really got a lot of scientists looking at this idea more carefully and with a little bit more depth to the sequencing past the phyla level, like get back down into class or family. And so they've been doing more studies. And this one was a very interesting one where they took identical human twins. And one of the twins was obese, one was lean, and they did a fecal transplantation experiment into germ-free mice. And then they watched to see, they kept the mice, separate from each other and just watched to see what would happen. And when they did that, the mouse that got the fecal matter from the obese twin became obese. And then the one that got the fecal transplant from the lean twin stayed lean. When this hit the news, it was like, what? I mean, people were super excited about this. And they're like, you're transferring, the obese or lean phenotype through, this action of what's in the microbiome of the feces. So then they carried out the study even longer. Oh, my picture's not showing up. So, here, what they did, so that was the first part of the study. Then what they also did was they said, well, what happens if we do that study again? And, but instead of keeping the mice separate from each other and watching what happens over time, let's put them together in the same cage. Look what happened. And when you look at the bar graphs here, so this is if they're kept separate after the fecal transplant on the far left there, and you can see big jump in fat content from the obese feces that were donated. Okay, whoops. Oh boy. There we go. And then you can see that the lean mouse stayed lean. So if they're in separate cages, then they said, okay, what happens if we put them together? Now, if you compare that left bar graph from the obese, if it's all alone, versus the obese if it's co-housed. See that huge drop in the bar graph, huge drop in the amount of gain weight. But the lean mouse stayed lean. So in the presence, when the obese mouse was in the presence of the lean mouse, it didn't gain as much fat. So what they're saying is the lean mouse, the microbes in the lean mouse was like superior, kind of swamped out. Because if you've ever watched mice interact, they groom each other, they eat each other's feces. All right, so there's fecal transplantation going on naturally when they're co-housed. And so they said, well, okay, it seems like the the obese mouse didn't gain as much weight if the lean mouse was right there with it. And so they're saying there's some natural transfer of the lean mouse microbiome to the obese mouse when they're co-housed like that. And then they did another one and they said, let's run that study again, put the obese and the lean mice that got the fecal transplant, but then let's add just regular germ-free mice. And so you had one that didn't get any fecal transplant, one that got the obese, one that got the lean transplant. And you can see that the germ-free mouse lost weight. So again, it's implying that the lean mouse microbiome was kind of superior to the obese microbiome, and it helped the germ-free mouse stay lean, actually lose weight. And so what they're piecing together from this study, as well as a bunch of others, they're noting this increased capacity to absorb energy. So what they mean is seems like when they looked at the microbiome of the obese phenotype, the microbes in the obese phenotype, they are better at extracting energy from the food that the human was eating and giving it to the human. So they gained weight. So it's all, it's like the microbes were really good at doing their physiology, and they gave more caloric energy to the host, which led the host to gain weight. So that is what they're seeing in the obese phenotype, that the microbes just seem better at extracting caloric energy from the food you eat and giving it back to the host. They also see, which seems to be very critical, a less diverse microbiome in the obese phenotype. So those microbes, they're just not as many of them, and fewer, population wise, and fewer species. And so less diverse all the way around. Okay. So this was a huge study, pretty well thought out, nicely done with the germ-free mice. And they were coming up with some really stunning results and conclusions. And so this was done a little while ago. And then probably one of the most famous is this one, done in 2006. This was a really early study and it was published in Nature. So a lot of people read this one because Nature is a huge journal. And they are saying, yep, changes in obesity is associated with changes in the relative abundance of what's happening in the Bacteroides and Firmicutes, like what we saw earlier a few slides back. So our results indicate that the obese microbiome has an increased capacity to harvest energy. That just means they're really good at extracting caloric energy from your food and giving it back to you, which then can lead to weight gain. Furthermore, this trait is transmissible. So colonization of germ-free mice with an obese microbiota results in significantly greater increase in total body fat. So it's like it's contagious in a way. It depends on, with these fecal transplant ideas, that this phenotype is transmissible. So this was a huge study result that got a lot of scientists. Then, let's try to figure this out a little bit better. But the idea that it really depends who are those microbes in the microbiome and how are they doing their physiology. And this bullet point down here, the nutrient value of the food that you eat is more so influenced by the host's bacteria digestive capacity, not yours, but what the microbes are doing to your food that you eat. That has a really strong influence than just if you look at the package of the candy bar that you eat and it says 200 calories. Well, that's one thing, but then you have to think about what kinds of microbes are hanging out with me and how good are they at extracting energy from that food, because some are way better than others, and that's what they're finding. So this is getting them thinking about, if we could figure this out, then we could really help humans and other animals that are overweight if we could do a specialized medicine probiotic, targeted for that. And what would be even better is prevention. Like if you take this probiotic, especially if they can look at genetics or other qualities where they think you might lead into an obese phenotype later, they could do preventative medicine with a targeted probiotic. So they're looking at these types of ideas, or they are even looking at, more extreme examples of, could you do fecal transplant? Well, we'll get into that. Super donors, where you can do fecal transplant human to human to try to correct something going on or to prevent. So they're looking at that idea too. But what they're finding in terms of the microbes doing their physiology, whether it's, this idea of extracting caloric energy, all the microbes there in your gastrointestinal tract, of course, they're all doing a ton of different physiology, a lot of fermentation because they're anaerobic. Most of them are anaerobic. And part of anaerobic physiology is fermentation. And when you see some of these microbes fermenting, these products are showing up over and over. When they analyze the short chain fatty acids in the human microbiome, these three win. I think it's greater than 98% of all the fatty acids showing up from microbes. It's these three. And so they're also looking very heavily at these, the C2, C3, C4 is just how many carbon atoms are in these three. And there's actually more acetate compared to propionate and butyrate. But these are, remember, acetate, the other way to say it is acetic acid, and then butyrate is butyric acid, and then propionate is propionic acid. So this was a nice visual showing all the things that they're starting to see are influenced by these short chain fatty acids. So these are being made by the microbes in the gut and then excreted out. It's just their fermentation. They aren't using these themselves. They're just excreting it out as waste, but our body can make good use of it. And so they're looking at all, anti-obesity, anti-diabetes, anti-cancer, liver health, cardiovascular health, neural health, and of course, constipation, and then also like ulcerative colitis, inflammatory bowel disease. And so these are produced if your microbes get the right types of dietary fiber. So if you feed your microbes as you're eating, you make some choices where you're getting the right types of dietary fiber, then they will make a bunch of these short chain fatty acids that are really healthy for you. So one of the papers that was studied, they were looking at, they zoomed into butyrate because they found really good results with microbes that produce a lot of butyrate on the health of the host. And what they realized is that butyrate is a source of nutrition for your intestinal cells. So the intestinal cells that line your intestinal tract, butyrate helps keep them healthy and fed, essentially. Gives them good nutrition. They also keep the tight junctions tight. You want that. You don't want the tight junctions to get loose or broken because then you get the leaky gut issue. They also find butyrate decreases inflammation. And they're looking at, they saw some really good results with obesity studies and diabetes. And even brain inflammation, neuroinflammation, or nerve cell inflammation. And they're looking at colon cancer suppression as well. They did some mice studies where if you create a situation where there's not enough butyrate in the mouse, then it led to ulcerative colitis. So these three short chain fatty acids in particular are getting a lot of attention. In fact, I don't know if it's, I think there might be something on the, over the counter shelf by now, but some scientists are saying maybe we should create butyrate supplements for people to take. And so you might see that showing up on the shelves over time. But other scientists are saying, well, if you eat a good balanced diet, you should be getting these short chain fatty acids in good enough supply. So you got to be careful about that. But basically what it's coming down to is your food choices. What are you eating? Even though a lovely donut can be very satisfying, but you really do need to think about your food choices, and in particular, thinking about dietary fiber, so that you are feeding your microbes. Like I've had people say, well, what kind of diet do you follow? And it's like a microbe-centric diet. I'm thinking about what can I do to keep my microbes happy, the good microbes happy. And so it's not really the donut that's going to do that. And so this was a more graphic visual, pretty extreme comment here, but every bite you take is either fighting disease or feeding it. And that's kind of on point. So it does, once you learn more about the microbiome and all the good it can do for you, it does make you pause when you are about to choose something to eat. You start to learn that you really do need, you got trillions of microbes that are depending on you to do the right thing. And so give that some thought. So of course, now they're like, okay, what kinds of diets are the best? Is there one diet that's just the best for the microbiome? And they're far from figuring this out in, really good detail, but some of the studies are showing some pretty clear differences already. And so in this paper, they were looking at a high-fat diet, a diet rich in red meat, or high fiber. And you don't, of course, need to know the details of all of this. What I'm trying to show with this visual is that you get these influences on who's there and how many of them are there. So the up and down arrows are saying, well, in the case of the high fiber diet, you had, Prevotella and Bifidobacterium, their populations rose. Actually, all of these are rising. With the red meat, you're seeing some rising, some falling, so these are just trying to show that you get the shifting in who's there and how many are there. And then down beyond that blue box, you start to see what are some of the products these microbes are making as you eat these foods, and then they get access to it. And you can see that there's definite, differences based on your diet. And so we want the short chain fatty acids. We want this idea. So high fiber diet is giving the short chain fatty acids that they are like, oh my gosh, these short chain fatty acids are really healthy for the human host. And then they're also looking, of course, at the effect on the central nervous system. And so you can see some clear differences here with the idea that in this case, with the high fiber diet, you're getting the short chain fatty acids that you need, creating anti-inflammation. So your chronic inflammation goes way down or prevents it, anti-anxiety. And that's really not the case showing up with the red meat diet or the high fat diet. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what's going on here in a minute. That needs a little bit of explanation, but here's another paper that was published. So let me And it's kind of hard to read, I suppose, from way back in the room. But basically, they're looking at what if someone follows a vegan or vegetarian diet, gluten-free, ketogenic, low, I don't even know if they say FODMAP. Does anyone know? FODMAP? I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that, but it's a thing. It's a diet for people who are diagnosed with inflammatory bowel disease, I think. Or what they call it. They don't call it disease. Inflammatory bowel syndrome. Then they prescribe a low FODMAP diet. I explain in the notes what that means. And then the Western diet and Mediterranean diet. So the different colored boxes are different groups of microbes. So the legend for those are down there. So they're looking at actinobacteria, firmicutes, proteobacteria, Bacteroidetes, and the Microbia. And then they're looking at immune system impacts, short chain fatty acid impacts. Okay, so that's how you interpret all the different colors and shapes. So then they're also looking at what's going on with your mucus. So this light blue here, they're looking at what's the impact on your mucus. So what's going on here? Mucus degradation, right? They're eating your mucus probably because they're not getting the right quality nutrients. Do you remember which diet that was? Ketogenic. That was surprising. I did not expect that. So I know that there was the question about what does a ketogenic diet do? Well, if that's happening, would you want to do that long term? That kind of diet? No. So I'm a little worried about that. So when they came up with, these different diets, when they came up with these all these years ago, no one looked at the microbiome. They just didn't do that. And I think that's anytime I talk to somebody or a friend or, just chatting with whoever, and they start to say, I'm following some of these diets, of course, my mind goes right to what's that doing to your microbiome? And of course, they don't talk about that. Your physician won't really talk about that either. So you got to be really, really careful. Please do your research and really talk to people who know what's going on with the microbiome. And Western diet, same idea, mucus, crashing. And then they're showing, in both the ketogenic and the Western diet that you get, the leaky gut syndrome. It's going. And then the red, remember the red bacteria, that's proteobacteria. Those are gram negative. You don't want a lot of gram negative or the LPS getting into your bloodstream.
Do you see any data on like the timeline of restoring microbiome after switching diets?
Yes, that's been a really cool question that they've been asking, like, can you fix this? We're on a Western diet, you tell, the doctor says, get off the Western diet, follow the Mediterranean. And they are doing these studies. And I think I have some data on one of them, and they can show a remarkable quick transition. So that's what makes me so hopeful. So if I do eat a donut or I love pizza on Friday and I'll indulge, but I know as long as I'm eating well throughout the week, a little bit of, not so good stuff is going to be okay. And then if some people totally switch, or maybe they grew up on meat and potatoes and then they switch to more of a vegan or vegetarian. And you can see a huge switch in the microbiome, and it can happen quite quickly, which is very encouraging. That means that, we have a lot of control on our microbiome based on what we eat. And that if you make mistakes or, indulge, it's okay. You can still get that back to the right composition. Okay. So this paper was looking at high fat diets, and which I think the ketogenic is pretty much a high fat diet just by what you eat. I think that's part of it. Is that true?
For what's in the program, it's like the original cause for it. So both my diet was advertised reports.
Yeah.
Which I think there are studies out there that would suggest that it is a microbiome thing that stops that blending.
Oh,
And
yeah,
that's like why it's doing that.
right. So if they could pinpoint the microbes.
Yeah. The whole thing is one of the toast is
Yes,
when you're
right.
so yeah, you can't eat carbs.
But long-term ketosis, I don't think is very
You
healthy.
probably don't want that.
No.
Even diabetics are told to avoid it.
Yeah.
As much as possible.
Yeah, so, but you know, a lot of people don't know that, and so they're like on the ketogenic diet for years. That's scary, and no one's telling them, "Oh, you know, you probably shouldn't do that." But here was high fat idea, okay, so, the permeability, they're saying high fat diet, your mucus crashes, permeability increases. So it enhances intestinal permeability, pro-inflammation, signaling cascades. And just, they're saying it tends to lead to a situation where the microbes that start to increase in number are the ones that are attacking your mucus and are able to get at your tight junctions. So high fat diet, definitely they're seeing some negative impacts on the microbiome. So this one, they were doing a switch. What if you do a Western diet and then I like the word prudent, do a prudent diet. So that's the better one in this case. And so they're saying, you know, what happens if you, and then you switch them, you know, like first they were on the Western, then you put them on the prudent and vice versa. So they did that. Granted, the sample size was only 8 adults. So take that with a grain of salt, but basically, if you look at the graphs here, endotoxin activity, so that's the idea that the lipopolysaccharides and the lipid A in particular of the gram negatives were getting through the mucus, getting through the barrier, getting into the bloodstream, which causes inflammation and other issues. So they're seeing, you know, before the Western diet, and then after the Western diet, you can see the lines are going up, you know, so they're saying endotoxic activity is definitely going up when these 8 people were on the Western diet. But you see the exact opposite when they were switched to the prudent diet, you see that they were able to correct and lower their endotoxic exposure. So this idea of switching diets, if it's, you know, it's not like, you know, some people are like, oh, what's the point? You know, it's not going to help. Yes, it will. If you switch your diet, it will help, you know, to a better diet. It's going to have an impact. It's not permanent. You're not doomed to have that specific microbiome. You can change it. And so here again, the prudent diet versus the Western diet, kind of a nice visual here, trying to explain, you know, what's happening under each situation, really zooming in on the mucus, the tight junctions, and looking at, you know, is it causing inflammation, chronic inflammation, you know, body-wide, systemic, or is it actually preventing that? And so again, you can see that the prudent diet wins. So this, to me, what they drew here, when they say prudent diet, doesn't that look like the Mediterranean diet, for those of you who know? I mean, that's what it looks like. And some current research that I've read, there's a lot of talk about the Mediterranean diet as probably one of the better diets out there in terms of overall health, both of the microbiome and your own, you know, body as well. So, Western diets, it's like a fast food diet there. See, yeah, you got some issues here. So this is chronic though. This is the way you eat more often than not. These are the types of situations. So when we were looking at that one, go back to this. No, not that one. Where was it? Was it that one? No. This one. When we go back to this one, some of these molecules showing up with the red meat diet. And I believe maybe they've already done this, but I believe there was talk about labeling red meat as a carcinogen. Has anyone heard about that? There was talk about that. I don't know if they've actually done that or not, but that's a little alarming. The fact that they're saying too much red meat can actually cause cancer. So let's go back to that, what we saw there. TMAO was one of the bad products that were being shown with the red meat diet. So it's also a situation that they can find in, not only red meat, but they're saying full fat dairy products and egg yolk get this TMA production, trimethylamine. Once those new food types are being broken down by your microbes in your body. And then your microbes, unfortunately, take the TMA and convert it to TMAO, which is trimethylamine oxide. And that's what they're finding is the potential carcinogen. And also adverse effect they're finding, you know, the increase in fat content in your blood vessels, which can lead to, of course, stroke and death. And so they're saying if you have a heavy red meat diet or, you know, tons of eggs, I was surprised to see the full fat dairy on there too, but it's not just your physiology, it's the action of how you're digesting, plus then the microbes take some of the TMA and convert it, and that's the danger. Yes.
Is it like all red meat or is it like just like bad?
I think this study was done mostly with cattle, you know, cows. But yeah, that's a great question. Like, what about some of the other red meat options? But I'm pretty sure this was cattle production, beef production in that. So yeah, a little alarming to see that. So, you know, when you think about some of the implications here, you have to factor in not only how your enzymes are digesting, but then what are the microbes doing? And then they're starting to say, you know what, even when the mom, they're finding even before pregnancy, what you eat, before you get pregnant, what you eat can have an impact on your child. And then as your child is developing, once you get pregnant, what you eat is impacting. And then when you nurse your child, what you eat is impacting. So any female that's thinking about having children at some point in your life, you really do need to give a lot of thought up front to your overall health and what you're doing to set up the situation that your pregnancy will be a good outcome and your child will be set up for a nice, healthy life. So you do have an impact on that. And so they were looking at prebiotic intake in this particular study, and this was with mice, but they have followed this out in a couple of small studies in humans, and they are seeing similar results. Sample sizes are low, so they have to do more research, but they're zooming in on the short chain fatty acids, butyrate, propionate. So yeah, it's even looking at brain development. So this, you know, it's an awesome responsibility if you get to have the privilege of becoming pregnant, and there's a lot that goes into it before you even become pregnant. So give that some thought. So these prebiotic ideas, I've just put this in here because I've had questions in the past, like what would make a good prebiotic? So the prebiotics are, remember, they're the stuff that you eat that really you don't digest, your microbes eat and digest. And that's the goal is give them food so that you can increase the populations, create a nice diversity. And so you can see a nice list here. So there's a lot of options. This isn't, by the way, a complete list. This is just some ideas. So a prebiotic feeds your microbes. A probiotic is you're taking in microbes. And then a symbiotic is if you take a probiotic and a prebiotic ideal at the same time. So you'll see at the store, they'll talk more and more. I've seen symbiotics being offered, or actually I see more of it labeled probiotics and prebiotics because not enough people know what symbiotic means. So, but anyways, why do you think they say underripe bananas? That made me scratch my head for a sec. Yes, not as much sugar. A slightly green banana has more fiber content because it hasn't been broken down. The more yellow and freckly the banana, the more sugary it is. The fiber's been broken down. So yes, and chocolate made the list. Yay. Dark chocolate. All right. So, okay. I guess, let's see, let me just finish. So inulin is the one that shows up in a lot of prebiotic things that you look at. So if you buy over the counter like fiber powder or whatever, sometimes you'll see inulin showing up in that, and they were looking at that on SARS, the SARS-CoV. Infection rates in an animal model, not human model, but they were looking at that and showing some interesting results. So they're looking at the microbiome and COVID ideas too, which I think is great. Okay, so we're gonna, I think I'm gonna stop here because we're gonna get into a little bit more about fiber and what that's doing for your microbes next time.